Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Flask logic, object-oriented programming, AJAX and sessions to create a fully working authentication system. Okay, so I've created a folder called login auth and I've opened it in my Visual Studio Code and in my terminal, and we're just going to create a virtual environment. So we'll say python -m venv and then we'll call it myenv. Once that's done, we'll say source myenv bin activate. And now that we have that at the start, we will start installing the dependencies. So for this one, we just need Flask. So pip3 install Flask, and we'll let that do its thing. And then over in Visual Studio Code, we'll start setting up our coding environment. So we need a templates folder and a static folder. We need a models.py, and that's going to hold all of our code for our objects. We need an app.py, which will be the one that we actually run, and this is going to hold our routes. And then inside the static, we will have a script.js, and inside the templates, we will have an index.html. So now that we have these set up, we'll just make sure that Flask is fully installed with no errors, and that has. So if we come back over to our app.py and we say from Flask, import Flask, we'll say render template, request, JSONify, session, redirect, and URL for. I'm just going to make my text a little bit bigger just in case. And then here we're just going to say app is equal to Flask, and we'll pass in name, and we're just going to give it a secret key as well, and because it's a test environment, we are just going to call it test environment. That's how you spell it? I think it is. So if you were actually going to be putting this live, that would need to change, but for now it's absolutely fine. So we can now create a route, and this is just going to be for our home route, so /, and we want an index function that is just going to, for the time being, return a render template for index.html. And then at the bottom of this, we'll just say if name is equal to main, app.run, and we'll pass in debug is equal to true. And then here in our index.html, we'll just create a HTML5 boilerplate. We'll change the title to the login authenticator. And we will just have a heading 1 that says hello world. And then now, because we have the index.html set up, we can make sure that the routes are working. So we'll say python3 app.py. And we have this running without any issues. So if I copy this and then come over to Google Chrome, and then we have hello world being outputted. So if I come back over to Visual Studio Code, we want to start adding in a few different things like Tailwind, jQuery, and just make sure that they work. So we'll say link, and then in the href, we are going to link to CDN for JS deliver, and this is going to be for Tailwind CSS, and we'll get 2.2.19 /dist /tailwind.min.css, and then we will also get a script, and this is going to be a Google script, so ajax.googleapis.com /ajax /libs /jQuery 3.5.1, and we're just going to get the minified file, and then we are also going to link to our own script. So what we'll do here is we will use Ginger syntaxing, and we'll say URL for static file name is equal to script.js. And now if I come over to here, we can create a document ready function. So we'll use the $symbol for jQuery, and we'll say document.ready, pass in function, and then in here we're just going to console log hello. So now if we come back over to Google Chrome and refresh, we have some styling brought in as default from Tailwind. It changes the font and the font size. And if we check the console, we have hello being outputted. So we actually have a working environment. Now, if we come back over to Visual Studio Code and we go over to our models, we will start by creating a user model and a user manager model. So the user model is just going to be every instance of the user, and then the user manager is going to handle things like loading and saving new users. So first of all, we're going to import JSON. We'll import OS, and then we'll say from worksug.security, we're going to import generate password hash and check password hash. So this is going to be a way of us taking a password, creating a hash of that password, and then checking the hash every time they log in to make sure that it actually works, or to make sure that they both link up correctly. And then if they do, then we know that they've got the password correct. So this is a more secure way of storing a password rather than just having the password. So we'll say class user, and we'll create initialization method with self, username and password. We'll say self.username is equal to the username, and self.password hash is equal to generate password hash, and we'll pass in the password that they've set. And then we will just create a toDict method so that we can actually return it as JSON. And we're going to return username of self.username and then password hash of self.password hash. So now that we have the return or the toDict method sorted, we'll create a check password just to make sure that they actually have got the password correct. So we'll say def check password self, and then we'll pass in the password as well. And we're going to say return check underscore password hash, and then self.password hash and password. So now we have our user created. We are going to create a user manager, and this is just going to be a class that will essentially keep track of all of the different users that we've made. So we'll say def init self file name is equal to users.json, and then we'll say self.file name is equal to file name, self.users is equal to self.load users. And now the load users function is going to, we are going to use the file that we've just, well, the file name that we've just created here, and we're going to pass it in, and we're basically going to read the users within that file. So we'll say def load users and self, and then we'll say if os.path.exists self.file name. Then we're going to open the file as f, so we'll say with open self.file name with read, because we're not manipulating the data, so we only want to read it at the moment. And then we'll say users data is equal to json.load, and then we'll pass in the file. And we're just going to return a dictionary that is the user's username, and then we're going to say user username and then password hash. And then at the end we'll say for you in users data. So this is going to loop through each user in the user's data, and it's going to return a dictionary where the username is an instance of the user, so this user up here, and we're going to pass in the username and the password hash. But if it doesn't exist, then we are just going to return an empty dictionary. So now we need a way to save users, so we'll say def save users self, and then we'll say with open self.file name, and here we're going to use write, and then we'll say json.dump, and we're going to create a list of dictionaries. So we'll say u.to_dict for u in self.users.values. So this is going to loop through all of these values, so the u.username, and retrieve these. And then at the end, we just need to pass in the file. So we are writing then to the file. And now we want a way to add a user. So this is going to essentially call the save users function. So we'll say def add user. We'll pass in self, username and password. And then we'll say if username in self.users, then we're just going to return false because we don't want to add a new one. So if it is in there, then it's going to essentially return on this line, so this next set of code won't run. So if it's not in there, then this code will. So we'll say self.users username is equal to a new instance of the user, and we're just going to pass in username and password. And now we can save the user. So self.saveUsers, and then we'll return true, just so that the function ends there. Now we want a way to authenticate the user and just make sure that the password that they've checked, or password that they put in, is true. So we'll say def authenticate user, self, username and password. And we'll say user is equal to self.users.get. I'm going to get the username. We'll say if user and user.check password, and we'll pass in password. Then we will return true. Otherwise we will return false. So that is our methods sorted for the models. If we come over to our app.py, we can now start actually creating the app logic. So now that we have the models created, we're just going to say from models import user manager, and we only need user manager because we're not actually going to be using the user outside of this specific file. So here with the app.py, we can now say user manager is equal to, and we'll create an instance of the user manager. So now we want to create a register route. That will be our first point of call. So we'll say app.route, and then we'll pass in register. And we're going to say methods is equal to post. And here we're just going to create a register function. Say data is equal to request.json. And then the request is what's being passed in from a form. So we'll say username is equal to data with the a name of username, so it will be an ID or a text field that has an ID or a name of username. And we'll say password is equal to data, and then the same. We'll say if user manager.add user, username and password. So we're going to pass in the data that they've just passed through when they've submitted the register form. And here we're just going to return JSONify. We'll say status, and we'll say user registered successfully. And then otherwise we're going to return JSONify status user already exists, and we'll pass 400 as well. So that is just going to create a 400 error. So now we've got a way to register, we want a way to log in. So we'll say app.root login. We're going to say methods is equal to post. And we're just going to create a login function that has a data request. So we'll take the request and we'll use the JSON. And we're going to say username is equal to data username, password is equal to data password. And then we are going to say if user manager dot authenticate user, and we'll pass in username and password. And then here we're just going to say session of username is equal to username, and then we'll return JSONify status login successful, and then otherwise we'll return another JSON variable, and we'll say status invalid username or password, and we'll use a 401 this time. Okay, so now we have our login and register functions. We need a way to log out, so we're just going to say app.root logout, and then we'll say methods is equal to, actually we don't need a method here because we're not actually submitting a form. This one's going to happen on click, and because we're not passing any data, we don't need a get or a post request. So we say def logout, and we're just going to say session.pop username, and we'll pass in none, and then we're going to return a redirect for URL4 and then index. So this, once you've logged out, you're going to be taken back to the index function, and here we can actually bulk out this function a little bit. So we'll say if username in session, so if you recall down here, we are passing the session username once they've logged in. So if they are logged in successfully and they have username in the session, then we're going to return render template index.html. We'll say logged in, we'll set that equal to true, and then we'll say username is equal to session, and we'll pass in the username session. And then otherwise we're just going to return render template index.html, and we'll also say logged in is equal to false. So now that we have our roots sorted, we can actually start working on the HTML. So now inside of this we can remove the heading 1, and we'll just create class for the body. We'll say bg gray 100 with padding of 6, which is a rem and a half. We're going to say heading 1, text 3XL, font bold, margin bottom of a rem and a half, and then text center, and we're just going to say login authentication system. And now we're going to use some ginger syntaxing, and we'll say if logged in, so if we are rendering this template, then I'm just going to create an else, and then an end if. Make sure you have this, because otherwise this won't work. It will throw an error. And we're just going to say div.textCenter margin bottom 6. We could create a p tag that has text 2XL margin bottom of 8, and this will just say hello username. So this is the data that's passed in from this sessions. And then we will create an A tag, and this is just going to route to logout. And we'll say BG red 500, just so it's got a nice red color, text white, and then we'll give it some padding and some rounded corners. It's just going to say logout. So that is the login page. So once you are logged in, you are literally going to see hello with your name or the username, and then a logout button. So now we need a way to actually create or show the forms and handle the user input from the front end. So we'll say div grid cols 2, and then we'll say colspan1, mx auto, bg white, padding of 6, rounded, shadow, and then a margin bottom of 6. We're going to have a heading 2 that just says register, and we'll give this some classes. We'll say text 2XL, font semi-bold, and margin bottom of 4. We're going to create an input that's type text, and we'll give this an ID of register username with a placeholder of username, and then we'll say class border p2 width full and margin bottom of 0.5 rem. We can remove the name, and now if I create an input type of password, we can again remove the name, and we will have register password, and then again classes of border, padding 2, width full, and margin bottom of 2, and we'll give it a placeholder of password. And then we will have a button that has an ID of register, and then this is just going to say register, and we'll give it a blue color with white text and some padding. So now if I come back over to Google Chrome, well, if I check terminal, make sure that it's all running still, and it is, and we refresh, we now have a login authentication system with the username and a password for the form. And now we need to create a way to log in once you've already registered. So if we come back over to here, and we are essentially going to be doing the same thing, but we need to make sure that we are inside of this grid. So we'll say div colspan1, mx auto, bg white, padding of 6, rounded, md, shadow, md. And then in this, we are going to essentially take that, and we'll change register to say login. And then because these are basically the same fields, we are going to paste those. We just need to make sure we change the IDs. So this is going to say login username, and then this is going to say login password. And if we take the button as well, and then change this to say login, and this to say login, so this has the ID of login. I'll make this a little bit clearer for you. So now we have a actual way to log in, but if we change the color of this to say green, just so that it's a little bit easier to read, and by all means, if you need to pause it to grab this code, then now's the chance. If we refresh, we have now a green button. So I can fill this in and press register and everything, but it's not actually going to do anything. And that's because there are no URLs set within this form, because it's not actually a form. We're not submitting any data currently until we add in our AJAX requests. So we come back over to our scripts. Here, we're just going to target the register button, and we'll say click function. I'm going to actually change this to .on and pass in click, just because I have some errors sometimes on .click, just with it supposedly being deprecated, but it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So now if we grab the username and the password values, we can send that through to the register route. So we'll say var username is equal to register username dot val, and we'll say password is equal to register password dot val, And now we're going to create an AJAX request. And here we're going to say URL/register. So we're going to point to the register route, which we have created in our app.py. And then we'll say type, set that to post because it is a post request. So now we need the content type, and we'll say application JSON. And then data, we're going to say JSON.stringify. And then inside of this, we'll say username, and then we'll set that to username and password, and set that equal to the passwords. So these two values are being passed through to the data request there. And now on a success call, we're going to say function, pass in the response that we get, which will be the status message that we have put into our app.py. And we'll say alert response.status. And then we're also going to have an error, and this is going to also have a response, and we'll alert the response. Response.response.json.status. Okay, so now outside of this event listener, we can start adding the login functions. So we'll say target the login, and we'll say on click, and we're going to create a function for this. Again, we're going to create a username, and we're going to grab the login username's value, and then the same for the password. So login_password.val. I'm just going to check that on the index.html we have the correct IDs. So the input text is register username, and then the input password is register password, which is there. So now the login username and login password, which we have here. Okay, so now if we create another AJAX request, and then inside of this we're going to say URL login, we'll say type post content type, set that equals to application JSON, and then it's going to be a JSON stringify again, and then inside of this we'll say username and password. And then we're going to add another success message, which is going to return the response. So we'll say alert response.status, and then we are also going to say window.location.reload, and this is just going to reload the page. And then we'll say error function response, and we'll say alert response.response.json.status. So now if we come back over to our terminal, just make sure that everything is still running. We can come back over to Google Chrome and refresh, just to make sure that our front end is all up to date, including the JavaScript. And then here we are just going to create a username. So we'll say beginner's code. And then here I'm just going to create a password, and this is just going to be test123. So now if I press register, we have the user registered successfully. So now we can check that the file has been created and the password isn't stored as test123. So now we have a users.json file. If I open this, we have the username of beginner's code, and then the password hash, which is a long string of letters, numbers, symbols. So now if I come back over to Chrome and I refresh, we want to actually try the login. So if I say beginner's code, and then here we're just going to say test123. If I login successful, okay, I'm going to get rid of that. And now because we are logged in and we have a session, we are showing a different layout, and that is due to this ginger syntax in here of the if else. So because we are logged in, we get hello beginners code and then a way to log out. So now if I just create a new one, we'll say Chris and password, user registered successfully, and then I'm going to try Chris and I'll say password but with a lowercase p. We get invalid username or password, okay, and then if I change that to be an uppercase P and login successful, we get hello Chris. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use object-oriented programming, Flask, AJAX and sessions to handle user input, storing the data and allowing a user to access different parts of a website depending on if they are logged in. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.